Hi everybody, it's Jeff from Ayala Tours, and since 1986 we've been connecting people to Israel and the Jewish world. We are the official travel partner for Israel trips for Hadassah. There are several coming up. We run trips all over the world under the banner of the Traveling University, featuring outstanding scholars such as Professor Stephen Berk. We run tours for Jewish singles and Jewish adults under the banner of the Best Day Adventure, and we run virtual programs. As it happens, we've got one coming up, and as long as I have everybody's semi-undivided attention, I'm just going to share my screen for one moment before we get going here, and let people know that we have officially started to publicize. I mentioned it last week, but we are officially now publicizing the virtual program for next month. This is going to be a very interesting series focused on the borders and the impacts of decisions made along the way in the Middle East, from World War I through the 1967 war, and then to Oslo. The historian who will be with us presenting the 3 out of 4 sessions will be Ralph Nurnberger. He does a lot of work for the Smithsonian, and we're very excited and looking forward to hearing from him. He was actually involved in the Oslo negotiations directly, so that session in particular, I'm very excited to hear from him. And then session 4, the 4th session in the virtual program, will be with Professor Berk, who will be talking about current events. There's a lot happening in the world today, and it is always, of course, enlightening to hear from Professor Berk. So you can register for this right on our website. Go to ayala.com. You can see the link right. It's one of the little images on our homepage. The early bird's going on through the end of this week, so now is the time to register. And hope you'll join us to continue learning and exploring together virtually. Okay. This, of course, is session 4 of our 5-part series on the Holocaust Revisited. There is a tremendous amount to cover, so just a couple logistical notes. As always, it's a recorded session. If you need a copy of this or a link to this, you can email my colleague Lisa, Lisa, at ayala.com, and she can get that for you after the program. It's live. If you're watching it this Tuesday in April 2025, it's the 22nd of April, and we want you to participate. So the Q&A function will allow you to post questions, and after Professor Berk's formal presentation, we'll get to as many of those as possible. And so to turn to France and Hungary, this on our 4th session out of 5 on the Holocaust Revisited, I turn it over to you, Professor Stephen Berk.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, my friends, for tuning in. A good evening and good afternoon for those of you who are on the West Coast. We have spoken about the plight of Jews in Germany, really in the period of the Holocaust. Essentially, Jewish life in Germany, at least formal Jewish life in Germany, comes to an end sometime in the early part of 1943. Nearly all the German Jews who were not in hiding had been deported, and virtually all of them had been killed. We then moved to Poland, the center of gravity of the Holocaust. 3.5 million Jews under the gun in one fashion or another. We talked about them, and then we ended last week talking about the Holocaust by bullets. That is, in the German-occupied areas of the Soviet Union, Jews were not sent to the gas chambers. They were shot down by the Einsatzgruppen, and probably 1,500,000, maybe closer to 2 million Jews are lying in mass graves in what were the German occupied areas of the Soviet Union. Now, we're going to shift now. We're going to deal with a democratic country where, in fact, the position of Jews should have been better, and indeed, in the end, was better. We're moving to France. Now, before we get there, there are things we have to say. Remember what I told you. And I tell this, and I keep saying it to you. I say it to the students at Union in the first day of every history class that I teach. You cannot explain the present by the present. Everything has a history. So I'm not going to go back into the medieval period. I'm simply going to begin on September 27th of 1791. This is in the midst of the French Revolution. On that day, the French Parliament said, that the Jews were emancipated. France was the first country in Europe to emancipate its Jewish population. And the Jews would continue to do well. They had some problems with Napoleon, but as we coursed through the 19th century, the Jews were almost everywhere. There weren't very many of them. Really, at the maximum, when World War II starts, there were 350,000 Jews out of a total French population, let's say, of about somewhere between 46 and 47 million people. So in the 19th century, there were even fewer. But the Jews did well. They were a middle-class community for the most part. They were in the universities as students and as professors. And remarkably, they were in the French army. They were even in the French general staff. Alfred Dreyfus of the infamous Dreyfus affair was a captain in the French army and in the French general staff. Remember, the general staff take the best and the brightest. They're always planning contingency programs, contingency plans in order for a coming war. And in the case of the French general staff, they were looking for a coming war with Germany. So the Jewish position in France is a good one, but for some French people, it was too good. The Jews were coming too fast. They were going too far, too fast. And the man who laid that out to the French people was a writer by the name of Edward Drumont, D-R-U-M-O-N-T. Drumont wrote a book, La France Juive, Jewish France, that went through multiple editions. And in the book, Drumont argued, the Jews were spreading out in France like an octopus. Their tentacles were reaching into every element of French, every area of French society. They were controlling France. It was nonsense, but the fact is, again, a number of people believed it. And then, of course, the exacerbation of anti-Semitism in France with the Dreyfus affair. I hope you're all familiar with that. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, accused of spying for the Germans, sent off to Devil's Island for a number of years, but eventually exonerated, acquitted, and they will find, that is, people who are investigating this will find out that he was in fact framed, that it was another officer in the French army that was selling military secrets to the Germans. But all's well that ends well in the 19th century or early 20th century. Dreyfus is brought back, he's acquitted, brought back into the army, and serves with distinction in the French army during the First World War. It is in the interwar period that things begin to get a little antsy for the Jews. Not in the 1920s, but in the 1930s. Remember, this is Depression time, and the Depression leaves a scar on French society. In times of Depression, one sees the extremist groups grow stronger. On the right, neo-fascist organizations, Action Française, for example, and on the left, growing support for the Communist Party. And what's going to make life difficult here for the Jews is that there's a terrible scandal in France in 1934. And the man who was really central to the scandal was a Jew, Alexander Stavisky. Now, Stavisky was really a bad guy. He sold worthless bonds, said that they were backed by gold and jewelry, all sorts of things. And of course, anti-Semites will make capital out of that. And so anti-Semitism is going to grow. And then two things are going to take place. First, in 1936, 1937, for the first time in French history, a coalition of socialists and communists gained control of the government. The prime minister of this, what is called a Popular Front government, was the socialist leader Leon Blum, a Jew. That drove anti-Semites up the wall. They were frightened. They were frightened of the coalition with the communists, and they did not like that Leon Blum, who was beginning to introduce social welfare legislation, higher taxes, and so on. So it's going to grow. Anti-Semitism is going to grow in France. But again, no violence perpetrated against the Jews, no reversal of emancipation. And then as war clouds begin to appear on the horizon, thousands of German Jews will flee into France. They'll get to France. And of course, France is preparing for war. Not preparing, unfortunately, well enough, but is preparing for war. But there's a lot of pacifism in France. Believe it or not, there was even support for Adolf Hitler. He seemed to end the Depression. He put Germany back on the map. He made Germany a great nation again. And there were people in France that thought that was really the best thing since sliced bread. They wanted a French leader like that. Anti-war feeling put its, let's say, attached itself, let's say, in blaming the Jews. These Jews who are coming from Germany, they're saying bad things about Hitler. They're talking about Hitler preparing for war. And the charge that was heard in France is these damn Jews. They're going to suck us into a war that we're not prepared for, and a war that we do not need. Be that as it may, these refugees are going, for the most part, be absorbed in France, but not completely absorbed. And it is a democratic French government. This is France of the Third Republic. This democratic government will actually intern thousands of Jews in, I wouldn't say prison camps, but detention camps. The most famous of them, it will eventually be a concentration camp, was one that we visit on our Ayala trips when we go to France. That's Drancy, D-R-A-N-C-Y. That was a camp really in the suburbs of Paris. So here we are on the eve of war. Then the Germans attack. In a course in World War II, I would spend a good deal of time talking about why France lost. The French are outmatched. They have more tanks than the Germans. They have more planes than the Germans. And they probably have more troops than the Germans. But the Germans are simply better. It's difficult for me to say this. Some of you may have heard me say this before. Man for man, in both world wars, the German army was the best army in the world. Highly motivated, junior officers given considerable initiative, and good generals. Hitler was not the best war leader, but German generals were very good. One of the problems the German army is going to have in the Second World War is that Hitler will thwart some of the designs and the plans of German generals. But what is important for us is that by June 14th of 1940, France has fought and lost. An ignominious defeat. France that had fought for 4.5 years in World War I and had won the war, played a major role in winning the war, now goes down to defeat in less than 6 weeks' time. Again, if you want to ask me questions about why that took place, I'd be delighted to answer. But for our purposes now, the apocalypse is going to come to France. The Germans are going to meet with the new representative of the French government. The French Chamber, the Chamber of Deputies, again, filled with consternation, humiliated by what has happened. Whom do they turn to lead France in the negotiations with Adolf Hitler? And that is France's last great surviving war hero of World War I. That's Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, P-E-T-A-I-N, the victor of Verdun, the man who saved the French army at Verdun. Here he is talking to Adolf Hitler, because Pétain believes that Germany is going to win the war. And Pétain believes that France has to find a place within Hitler's new order, which means that under Pétain, that part of France which he rules is going to be a collaborationist part of France. When the Germans took over, when they won the war in France, when they defeated France, France was divided in a number of zones. 2/5 of France, including the city of Paris, were in what came to be known as the occupied zone. That is, the Germans had control. So that's in the northern part of France. In the southern part of France, you can see on the map, there's a demarcation line between the occupied zone and the northern and the southern zone. There in the southern zone, in the resort city of Vichy, V-I-C-H-Y, Pétain was able to set up a French government. This is really known as, this is Vichy France, the Vichy French government. And so Jews are in both zones. The fifth, another part, of course, is going to be a slice of territory on the Italian border, including the city of Nice. That's going to become the Italian zone. As France was falling, Mussolini, who did not participate in the attack upon France, as France is reeling back, Mussolini sends the Italian army into that particular area in France. That's what prompted Franklin Delano Roosevelt to say, the hand that held the dagger stabbed France in the back. He was, of course, talking about Mussolini. What, let me say to you, we'll get right to the chase here. In the Italian zone in France, there was very little anti-Semitic legislation, and there was no incarceration of Jews. And in fact, the Italian army occupying that particular zone of France refused all attempts by the Germans to deport the Jews from that zone. So whatever one may say about the Italians and the Italian abysmal performance of Mussolini's treachery in World War II, the fact of the matter is, wherever Jews could find themselves under Italian control, they would survive. The problem, of course, is Italy pulls out of the war in 1943, and the Germans take over all the Italian-occupied areas, and then, of course, the murder and the deportation of Jews will take place. But up until that time, in 1943, whether it was in Yugoslavia, whether it was in Albania, whether it was in Greece, and whether it was in France, wherever the Italians were, Jews would be saved, up until, of course, 1943. In the unoccupied zone, one began to see an influx of a number of Jews who were fleeing. They wanted to flee from the Germans, but also many anti-Semites. Believe it or not, there were people who were anti-Dreyfusards in the 1890s. Some of them were still around. They now go to Vichy France. Pétain was the leader of Vichy France. He's going to be a collaborator. His prime minister was Pierre Laval, L-A-V-A-L. Laval will issue anti-Semitic legislation in the unoccupied zone. Jews will be thrown out of the businesses, out of the civil service, out of the army, and Jewish professionals will be limited. It's a very difficult time, not impossible, but very, very difficult for the Jews in the unoccupied zone. In the occupied zone, the Nazis are going to implement very, very quickly a good deal of hostile Jewish legislation, and there will come a time, really in 42, that the Jews in both zones will be forced to wear the yellow star. So here we are, but now I have to go back. I've got to go back to around November and December of 1941. It's at this time historians believe that Hitler has made a decision to exterminate the Jews all over Europe. Remember again, forgive me for repeating myself, in the German-occupied areas of the Soviet Union, the Jews are being mowed down. That's the Holocaust by bullets. But up until 1942, there was no movement. Again, there was legislation, hostile legislation, but no movement to deport the Jews. That changes in 1942. And a deal seems to have been worked out. Not seems, a deal was worked out by Marshal Pétain and the German forces, the military and the SS units in the occupied zone. And the deal was this. Marshal Pétain agreed that he would facilitate the deportation of all foreign Jews living in France. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of Jews from all over Europe had fled to France in the 1920s and the 1930s because of anti-Semitism in Poland, wherever it may be. Tens of thousands of Jews had come into France. They were allowed to come into France, but they were not given citizenship. They were not French citizens. In fact, of the 350,000 Jews in France at the time of the Second World War, less than half were native French citizens. So more than half of the 350,000 were foreign Jews. And what Pétain is going to do, Pétain and Laval, is to strike this deal. To be fair to them, Pétain and Laval, they wanted to protect, let's say, native French Jews. That's what they wanted to protect. And they offered the Germans the foreign Jews. Did they have to do this? Could they have resisted? Here is something, we'll talk about that in Hungary as well. The Germans, remember, in this period of time, 1942, the Germans are fighting in the Soviet Union. This is Operation Barbarossa. They really have skeletal forces operating in France. The deportation, the rounding up and the deportation of Jews could not have taken place without the support of the French police, the French civil service, and the French railroads. So what's going to happen here is, comes the late spring and summer of 42, Jews are rounded up in the occupied zone and in the unoccupied zone. Thousands of Jews from the unoccupied zone will be shifted into the occupied zone, put in transit camps. Drancy was the most famous, but there were others, Gurs, and there were a number of others. And from there, they will be sent to Auschwitz. Most of the people, but not all of them, that were rounded up were foreign Jews. 77,000. 1/3 of the 77,000 that were deported were, in fact, native Jews. Comes 43 and 44, the Germans are going to take any Jew that they get their hands on. The most notorious roundup is going to take place on July 16th and 17th of 1942. That's the famous roundup at the Veldiv, the bicycle stadium in Paris. It is absolutely horrible. Men, women, and children, very few toilet facilities, very little water, very little food coming in. You get a sense of that if you saw the film or read the book Sarah's Key. There's some very poignant scenes of what happens at the Veldiv. So these people, for the most part, are going to be deported. 77,000, again, are going to be deported. Of the 77,000 that were deported, somewhere between 75,000 and 76,000 will be murdered primarily in Auschwitz. You can take this through film. One of the romantic films of this time was The Last Metropole, a very good film about a French theater company that's operating, that's performing under the German occupation. And there's a Jew or a number of Jews, and the theater group really celebrates them, or not celebrates them, but protects them. And these people are going to survive. But that's not always the case. There was a good deal of collaboration. People did respond to Marshal Pétain. So when Pétain, again, his government deported the Jews, people went along with Marshal Pétain. If you like to take your history through film, there's not only the Last Metro, that was the name of the film, but there is a marvelous series, a really very good, it's a long series, but it is absolutely superb. It is called A French Village. It's in French, but it's got good English subtitles. It's a French village under the German occupation. And there's a strong Holocaust component in there. I strongly recommend that to you. So what's going to happen now is there's going to be deportations. 77,000 Jews will be deported. The French police, the French civil service, all of these people are going to collaborate with the Germans, and without their collaboration, the Jews would not have been deported. But some of them have time, many of them have time to go into hiding. And remember, this is the France of liberté, égalité, and fraternity. There are many French people who are going to shelter Jews. Jews will find places to hide. And France is a large European country. France is the only European country outside of Ukraine and Russia that is larger than the American state of Texas. There are forests, there are mountains, there are places where the Jews can hide. So a combination of things. One, the sympathy that is given by many French people to the Jews. Two, the fact that in the beginning of the deportations, only foreign Jews are rounded up, and Jews go into hiding. So all of these things are going to take place. And then by the time we get to 1943 and 44, many people in the French civil service, in the French bureaucracy, because of what they've seen, what the Germans have done to the Jews, they're going to rally to the Jewish cause. They're going to somehow try to shelter the Jews, warn the Jews, and do things like that. And then there is that wonderful story of Chambon. I'm not giving you the same title, the same name, or the full name of that French village. It's a Protestant village, and it will shelter thousands of Jews. Even though, and most of the people know that, and the leader of that village, the mayor of that village, was horribly tortured by the Germans. He does not divulge these things, where the Jews are, and none of the Jews in Chambon are going to die. But the Germans are very zealous. There are a number of names you should know. One is Klaus Bobby, an SS man, the butcher of Lyon. This is the man that very diligently combed every possible place in Lyon to get Jews, including Jewish children. And then there are some other names that you should know. One of them was a real hero, one of the real righteous Gentiles. The Catholic Church in France took its cues from the Pope. And as we will talk about next week, Pope Pius XII said absolutely nothing, really almost nothing. Did not tell people to help the Jews, did not warn the Jews, did not do anything. And clerics, Catholic clerics all over German-occupied Europe followed his lead. In more than one occasion, a high-ranking Catholic prelate is going to say, if the Pope says nothing, we say nothing. There was a letter that was sent out from Vichy to the Vatican. Are we doing these persecutions of the Jews, restricting them, doing all sorts of things? Is this a violation of canon law? Is it really, is it wrong? And the answer that came back from the Vatican, not clear if Pope Pius XII knew about the answer, but the answer that comes back is, you can do what you want to the Jews in terms of legislation. You can restrict them, you can strip them of their citizenship, you can do anything that you want, but you are not to resort to physical violence against the Jews. But that's a very thin line, isn't it? And so the Catholic Church, for the most part, is not going to play a major role, in fact, not even a minor role, in helping the Jews, with one exception. That's Archbishop Salège of Toulouse. This man had, forgive my crudeness here, this man had the balls from the altar in his church to talk about Vichy's and German persecution of the Jews as being unchristian, anti-Christian, and that it was incumbent upon all good Christians to come to the defense of the Jews. He's going to survive this, but he's a lone voice. This is really a very decent man, and when after the war in 1946, we were promoted to be a cardinal of France. And the other one, this is a man, again, he died recently. Forgive me, I don't remember his name. He won the Nobel Prize, I think, in psychology. He was 90 years old, and he died. Now, not in the obituary, but when he got the Nobel Prize, there were some stories about him. And the most interesting story was that he was in Paris under the German occupation as a very young boy, as a teenager, maybe 12, 13, or 14 years old. And during the curfew, he was out during the curfew. He could have been shot. He could have been shot by the Germans. But a sympathetic German officer, that's almost an oxymoron, but there were some people like that, they told him, go away, kid. I'll look the other way. Go back home as quickly as you can. I only mention that to you because it's something that I've talked about before. Maybe I'll end with that. That is in the next lecture. But it's important here because here, this is a living example of it. And that is, we always talk about the quantitative nature of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews among the 1,500,000 Jewish children. Those are terrible figures. But there's a qualitative aspect of the Holocaust. This is a Nobel Prize winner. How many future Nobel Prize winners in medicine, in physics, in chemistry, in economics, how many future Nobel Prize winners really never saw the light of day in terms of what they could do because they were murdered? Some of the most gifted people in Europe were to be found in the Jewish communities all over Europe. Who would have known? Was there a cure for cancer coming out of one of these people? Were there great steps in medicine, in science, in chemistry, in all of those areas? We'll never know, will we? But always think, never forget the 6 million, never forget the 1,500,000 Jewish children, but also remember the qualitative aspect, the qualitative nature of the Holocaust. Some of the best minds in Europe would never be able to perform and contribute to humanity because they were murdered by the Nazis. All right. France was a democratic country. This is the country of the Third Republic. And things worked out well. I know many Jews, because of France's policy sometimes vis-a-vis Israel, is not what we would like it to be. But the French record in the Holocaust is a good one. In fact, it's the best record that you could argue, with the exception perhaps of Italy, but it was a much smaller Jewish community in Italy. The French record is probably the best in Western and Central Europe. That is 350,000 Jews in France. Let's say a shade over 75,000 are murdered. That means that 75% of the French Jewish community survived. That's one of the best records in Europe. And I tried to explain to you why that took place. Now we shift over to another country, a country that was a pseudo-democratic country, a country that had a parliament, and a country that had a democratically elected, you could argue, prime minister, and a country that had a very large numbers of Jews. By the time of the Second World War, certainly into 1940, 1 year into the war, the total number of Jews in Hungary was about 825,000. Now, it's a large figure. Hungary before the war probably had about 600,000 Jews, 650,000 Jews. But because of an alliance with Hitler, Hitler allowed Hungary to seize certain areas from Czechoslovakia and Transylvania from Romania. In those areas, that's where Elie Wiesel lived. That is in that area of Transylvania that was annexed to Hungary. Then the figure of Jews increases very dramatically, goes up to even 800 and 825,000. And again, we got to go back. We got to go back in history to understand what happened here. I'm not going to go back into the medieval period. If you're coming with me to Europe, to Eastern Europe, we go to Budapest, I'll talk a little bit about that. But suffice it to say that under the Habsburg Empire, particularly in the second half of the Habsburg Empire, when the area becomes known as Austria-Hungary, Hungary was an autonomous part with its own parliament, with its own prime minister. That's as a consequence of what's called the Ausgleich, the Compromise of 1867, when the Habsburgs finally agreed to give Hungary autonomy. That's Hungary. It's a large country, but not as large as it's going to be in 1940, because it's going to have Transylvania, it's going to have other areas as well. So let's get going now. The Jewish position in Hungary was a good one. In fact, it used to be said of Hungarian Jews, very highly assimilated Hungarian Jews, they went to the synagogue 4 times a year, twice on Rosh Hashanah, once on Yom Kippur, and once on the Emperor Franz Joseph II's birthday. Franz Joseph was good for the Jews. The Habsburg Empire was by and large good for the Jews. And the Jews in Hungary, as I said, did well. Well represented in journalism, in the universities, among students, among doctors. Jews did well. There was anti-Semitism. There was even a blood libel charge. And then things go sour, as we would say. It's Hungary's great misfortune to enter both world wars on the losing side. And Hungary paid a price for this. When World War I is over, everybody knows how the Allies, the British, French, and the Americans, socked it to the Germans at the Treaty of Versailles. Not far from Versailles is another palace. That's the Palace of Trianon, Trianon. That's when the Hungarian, now it's a Hungary. Habsburg Empire has been blown up, no more. There's an Austria and there's a Hungary. But because Hungary had fought on the German side as part of the Habsburg Empire, the Allies are going to treat Hungary very, very harshly. They will take away over 50% of Hungary and give it to new countries created at Versailles. Transylvania goes to Romania. Croatia goes to the new Yugoslavia. Slovakia goes to the new Czechoslovakia. Large chunks of territory taken away from Hungary, and large numbers of Hungarians now find themselves living outside of Hungary. Now, it used to be said, Budapest is the place where the largest number of Jews were. In fact, one anti-Semite said, let's say 25 to 30% of Budapest was Jewish, and the anti-Semite said, we should rename the city of Budapest Judapest. Now, I don't want to lose you here. Here, things are very interesting in Hungary. Hungary was governed by a Hungarian leader by the name of Admiral Horthy, Horthy. Horthy was an admiral. I think I've said this to some of you before. You may ask me a question. How does Hungary have an admiral? Hungary is landlocked. But when Hungary was part of the Habsburg Empire, when the Habsburg Empire was in existence, the Habsburgs had a navy, and the navy was in the Habsburg part of Italy, the area known as Trieste. That's Admiral Horthy. Not the sharpest tool in the shed. This is not a gifted political leader. What's going to happen in Hungary under Horthy? Because Hungarians, again, it's a poor country. Hungary wants limitations on the Jews. Hungary is the first country in Europe, parliamentary government in Europe, to pass anti-Semitic legislation. In the 1920s and the 1930s, Hungary had a number of anti-Semitic legislative acts, limiting the Jews in the professions, limiting the Jews in the universities, limiting the Jews in business. So it's tough. But Hungarian Jews loved Hungary. There is some, but very, very little emigration from Hungary to Palestine. If you were my students, I would ask you, who's the most famous Hungarian Jew that went to Palestine in the 1930s? And she's a rarity. Her family and her friends think she's absolutely crazy. That was Hannah Senesh. Hannah Senesh, a real heroine of the Second World War, who parachuted into German-occupied Europe and was killed, tortured and killed by the Germans. But in the 1920s and the 1930s, anti-Semitic legislation. And then, most important for the future, there appeared a Hungarian fascist organization. Please remember that Hitler was very popular in Europe. All over Europe, there were people who admired Hitler. He ended the Depression. He made Germany a great nation again. People admired him. And people who were anti-Semites thought he was the cat's pajamas. And so in the Hungarian police and the Hungarian army, an organization planted its roots. In English, it's called the Arrow Cross. In Hungarian, it's the Nyilas and the Arrow Cross. Vehemently anti-communist and vehemently anti-Semitic. Keep them in mind. But in the 20s and 30s, Jews, even under the restrictions, are not doing badly. Better than in Poland. Well, that's a matter of debate. Before the war, whether Poland was a better place for Jews than Hungary. But there were Jews well represented in the middle class and in the professions. Then the war comes, and Hungary is seduced by Hitler. Hitler tells the Hungarians, you enter the war, you participate in Operation Barbarossa, and you will get certain territories. And the Hungarians enter the war on the German side. And along with that is going to become an exacerbation of anti-Semitism. Tens of thousands of Jewish men were now conscripted into labor service. These are the labor service battalions. The conditions that these people are working under are terrible. And it's believed that 30 to 40,000, well more than half of the people, the Jews in labor service, are going to die in labor service. It's not so bad when the Jews are in the labor service battalions, are functioning or working in Hungary. But when the Hungarians participate in Barbarossa, then the labor battalions, some labor battalions, are sent to help the Hungarians fight against the Soviets. You know what their role is? They're sent forth to detonate minefields. They draw artillery barrages. They're murdered by the thousands. And that means when things get really bad in Hungary, the most virile elements of the Jewish community are not there. Tens of thousands are in the labor service battalions. So the war goes on. Hungary is in the war. Hungary is a German ally. And then Admiral Horthy. Horthy and his Prime Minister Kalle refused German requests to deport the Jews. They would not deport the Jews. There's one terrible incident that occurred. That is, a number of foreign Jews from Poland had fled into Hungary. Hungary was an oasis during the war, up until March 19th of 1944. Hungary was an oasis. There were tens of thousands of Polish Jews, Romanian Jews who had come into Hungary. The Hungarian government rounds up about 25,000 of them, throws them over the border into German-occupied Ukraine. And in the summer of 1941, they're murdered. This is up until Babi Yar, which took place at the end of September of 1941. This is the largest murder of Jews in a single day, or in 48 hours, if you want to stretch it. That was to take place up to this period of time. And there was a public outcry in Hungary, not only from the Hungarian Jews, but from others. And those deportations, for the most part, are going to stop. Hungary was a good German ally until it wasn't. Because in the early part of 1944, Admiral Horthy had come to the decision that Germany is going to lose the war. And therefore, he sent out secret feelers to Allied representatives wanting to pull Hungary out of the war from the German side, pull Hungary out of the war. German intelligence picks that up. Hungary was too close to Germany. The Germans could not allow Hungary to pull out of the war. So on March 19th of 1944, the Germans carried out Operation Margareta. They occupied Hungary. Hungary was transformed from being an allied country to being an occupied country. There you see Hungary under attack, and Hungary was totally occupied. And who do you think is going to come to Hungary now that the Germans have occupied it? The angel of death, Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann now comes and deals with Horthy. And Horthy makes a deal very much like Petain had made, only it involved more people. Horthy says to the Germans, you want the Jews? I'll give you the Jews, all the Jews in Hungary outside of Budapest. I'll even give you the Jews from the suburbs of Budapest. There are small towns in the vicinity of Budapest. You can even take them. You can take them, but don't touch the Jews of Budapest. And so beginning in April of 1944, the Jews in the rest of Hungary are rounded up. And by the end of April, they're being placed on trains. 430,000 of them will be sent to Auschwitz. Another 100,000 will be sent into other labor camps. But 430,000 are going to be sent to Auschwitz. At the initial arrival in Auschwitz, 75% of those Jews deported from Hungary are going to be gassed and cremated. This is the Holocaust at high tide. More than 5,000, sometimes 8,000 Jews per day are going to be gassed in Auschwitz. So many Jews were being gassed at Auschwitz that the inconceivable takes place. That is, they're being killed in that part of Auschwitz II known as Berk now. That's where the gas chambers and the crematoria are. The Germans run out of Cyclone B. And so many Jews are being cremated that the walls of the chimneys in some of the crematoria are beginning to crack. And to show you German diligence and how dedicated the Germans were to the murder of Jews, there is, of course, this incident where Commandant Heuss, if you saw the film Zone of Interest, this is Heuss. He's the commandant at Auschwitz, the main commandant at Auschwitz. And he says he's in his diary, he's got a problem. I got all these Jews coming in from Hungary. A lot of Jewish kids are coming in. I don't have any Cyclone B. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Where there's a will, there's a way. Remember, our teachers used to tell us that, but that can work for evil as well as for good. And so what happens is the inmates chop down trees. They dig ditches. He doesn't have Cyclone B, but he's got kerosene. Dumps the kerosene, sets on fire, and drops the Jewish kids into the fires. Heuss will also write, my soldiers showed incredible humanity. When they saw a Jewish child screaming, they took the butt of the rifle, hit him over the head, rendered him senseless, and then threw him into the fire. So the child didn't go screaming into the fire. So here we are, the Holocaust at high tide. Why don't more Jews die? Now, the answer is because there's an intervention, a number of interventions. And I must tell you here, in the roundup of the Jews, we'll get to the interventions in a moment. In the roundup of the Jews, Again, it was as it was in France. That is, the Germans were struck for manpower. The roundups of the Jews, and putting them on the trains, and the deportations could not have taken place without the support of the Hungarian police and the Hungarian army. They wanted the Jews out. They're the ones that round them up. They're the ones that put them on the trains. And so the Jews are deported and they're going to be murdered. But how does it happen that 200,000 Jews survive? Again, probably less than a quarter, but let's say 25% of the Hungarian Jews survive. How did they manage to survive? One of the major reason is, well, the coming of the Red Army in January of 45. You got to give the Red Army credit. The Red Army, of course, Stalin didn't order the Red Army to save Jews. But as the Red Army pushed the Germans back, it liberated Auschwitz, it eliminated the extermination camps, eliminated many of the concentration camps. And in the middle of January of 1945, it liberates Budapest. Had the Red Army not come, all the Jews of Budapest would have been killed. But before that, there were some men. Remember, personality counts in history. Men can change the course of history. The most famous of them was Raoul Wallenberg. Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, a tzaddik from the time he was a child. Raoul Wallenberg will intervene. He'll issue passports. He'll buy up apartment houses, fly the Swedish flag there, give Schutzpasses, protection passes to Jews. It's a matter of debate as to how many Jews he saved. Was it a minimum of 10 to 15,000, or did he save over 100,000? But he intervenes again and again and again. And it is not easy to intervene. Horthy was one thing. Horthy stopped the deportations on July 9th of 1944. The reason for that was 2 Jews had escaped from Auschwitz in April. Everybody knew in the rest of the world that Hungarian Jews were being deported, but no one knew where they were going, and no one knew what happened to them. These 2 men escaped from Auschwitz. They went to Bratislava in Slovakia. They met a papal representative, not a papal nuncio, but a priest. And they drew for him pictures of the gas chambers and the crematoria, and they relayed what was happening to the Hungarian Jews. Then in May, 2 more Jews escaped, and they brought further news about what was happening. Now, here I go to the side and tell you, I may have said this to you before, some of you in another context, in another lecture. There I am lecturing at Congregation Beth Tzedek in Toronto, a beautiful conservative synagogue, I think the largest conservative synagogue in the world, in fact. And I'm giving a lecture, 4 lectures on Auschwitz. My wife told me I was crazy for giving it, and she said, Beth Tzedek, they were crazy for asking you. But I gave a lecture on people who had escaped from Auschwitz. I gave them into 4 names, and I mentioned a man's name by the name of Czeslaw Mordovich. He was one of the 2 that escaped in May, and also met the same priest in Bratislava. And he gave him more specific details about what was happening to the Jews, the Hungarian Jews in Auschwitz. A woman raises her hand in the question and answer period and says, Professor Berk, do you know that Mr. Mordovich is sitting here right beside me? It was as if a man came out of a history book. Unbelievable. I brought him to Union College, and we gave him an honorary degree in 1995 because it was the 50th anniversary of Auschwitz. So he escapes from Auschwitz. His testimony, together with the other 2 men, come to be known as the Auschwitz Protocols. The Pope gets wind of it. Horthy gets wind of it. The British and American government, they put pressure on Horthy. Horthy seizes the deportations. The Nazis are not satisfied. Hitler arrests Horthy and appoints in October of 1944 an Arrow Cross prime minister and creates an Arrow Cross government. Now, what's going to happen now is the Arrow Cross rampages across Budapest. When you go, whether with me or anybody else, you'll go to the Danube and you'll see an incredible memorial of porcelain shoes. That's a memorial to the Jews that were chained together, either with metal or by rope, by the hundreds on the shores of the Danube, and then the Nilash would shoot a couple of them, and they would pull everybody into the water, and they were drowned. So another 100,000 Jews are going to die in this fashion or in other fashions at the hands of the Nilash. But Wallenberg was not the only one to intervene. There were others. Angelo Ratta, the papal nuncio, a Catholic priest, he will intervene with the Hungarians, even with the Nilash, and save thousands of Jews. So it's not only Wallenberg, it's Angelo Ratta. And then the Swiss diplomat, Karl Lutz, who will also issue visas, issue biohouses. He too will save Jews. That's Karl Lutz. When we go to the Doheny synagogue, for those of you who are coming with me in the summer, we will see a memorial to Karl Lutz. And this is a great man. Switzerland did not behave very well during the war in relation to the Jews, but individual diplomats did. He's one of them. The strangest of them all was an Italian fascist. We don't have a picture of him. That's Giorgio Prolasca. Prolasca had actually fought for Franco and the fascists in Spain. So well did he fight, or not whether he fight, not the fact that he did fight, led the Italian government, the Mussolini, to give him a letter, and he had another letter from the Franco's government. And the letter said, if you're ever in trouble anywhere, the letter from the Spanish government said, go to the Spanish embassy. They'll get you out of trouble. On business, he goes to Budapest, is appalled by what he sees, although he's a fascist, is appalled by what he sees, and asks the Spanish embassy to do something in behalf of the Jews of Hungary. Because the Russians were not far away, the Spanish embassy had fled. So Prolasca, in effect, takes over the Spanish embassy. And in the Spanish embassy, he issues thousands of, let's say, Spanish visas to Hungarian Jews and saves a large number of them. You never can tell about personality, especially the way people behave in wartime. And then I told you this is a very interesting history in Hungary. We come to another man. This is a very, very controversial man. But there's a bottom line here. This man saved 1,600 Jews. It's how he did it. For some people, not for me, is a matter of controversy. This was Rezső Kastner. Rezső Kastner. Kastner was the leader of the small Hungarian Zionist movement. Zionism was not strong in Hungary, not strong at all. And he was the leader of it. When Eichmann comes to Budapest, Kastner goes to see him. We're not sure who proposes this. Did Eichmann propose it? Or did Kastner propose it? Or did Himmler tell Eichmann to propose it? Here's the deal. Eichmann tells Kastner, you go to Istanbul. You talk to the British and the Americans. Turkey was neutral. And you tell them this. If I give them, oh, that's not right. If they give me 10,000 trucks and jeeps and medical supplies, I will give you 1 million Jews. This is what is known in history as Blut für Ware, blood for goods. Is this the last attempt to save Jews? Had the Allies bought into it? Could they have saved 1 million Jews? The answer is probably not. There weren't 1 million Jews in German-occupied Europe that were alive. And besides, this deal could never have gone through. Himmler, through Eichmann, is telling Kastner to tell the British and the Americans, don't worry, whatever you give me, I will not use you against you on the Western Front. I will only use it against you on the Eastern Front. Against the Russians on the Eastern Front. Don't worry, it won't affect American, French, British, Canadian forces operating in France. Won't affect it. I'll fight only against the Russians with this material. This didn't stand a snowball's chance in hell of being accepted. In the Second World War, we didn't trust the Russians didn't trust us. But on both sides, the Russians and our side, we wanted to preserve the coalition. Without the Allied coalition against Germany, we would not have won the war. No American government is going to accept that deal. What if the Russians found out about it? After the war was over, we found out that Stalin did know about this. So in fact, had we negotiated with the Germans, it might have split the coalition and protracted or lengthened the war. So it's not done. But here's where things get sticky and controversial. Kastner, no dummy, tells Eichmann, you can send me or I'll send a representative. They won't believe you. They know who you are. These are not the words he's using, but that's in effect what he's saying to Eichmann. You know what you can do to gain their trust, to gain some belief, credulity on their part? Let me pick 1,600 Jews, put them on a train, and send them to Switzerland, to a neutral country where they will survive. And Eichmann agrees. And Kastner picks the people. And the 1,600 Jews get on the train in Budapest, and they go on their way to Switzerland. The problem is going to be, we're not sure of this. The train stops for 3 weeks in Bergen-Belsen, a bad camp. They're all bad. This was a particularly bad one because of starvation and typhus. This is where Anne Frank died. She doesn't die in Auschwitz. She dies in Bergen-Belsen. Now, a man who has come on our trips, I'm sure he won't mind my mentioning him. He's also a Union College graduate and an ophthalmologist in West Palm Beach. That's Dr. John Merry. Merry was 4 years old. He was on the Kastner train. And he told me in the class that had they stayed more than 3 weeks in Bergen-Belsen, they all would have died. There's no food. But all of a sudden, they're informed. His mother and father are there. Cousin is there. Relatives are there. Friends are there. They're told to get out of the barracks, get on the train. The train goes to Switzerland, and they survive. Kastner has saved. Kastner is a Hungarian Schindler, to put it in the proper context. But, as Elie Wiesel says, there's always a but. And the but is, when the war is over, Kastner survives. A Hungarian Jew who lost all of his family, or nearly all of his family in Budapest, is now in Israel. Kastner goes to Israel. And this Hungarian Jew, a man by the name of Grunwald, accused of Kastner of being a collaborator. You talked to the Germans. You didn't warn the Jews. Why didn't you warn the Jews? Schrei Gewalt, scream from the rooftops. Why didn't you tell the Jews of Hungary what was going to happen to them? Was it part of the deal? It probably was. That Eichmann told Kastner, keep your mouth shut. You'll put the Jews on the train. You'll send somebody to Istanbul, and so on and so on. Then the controversy also goes on. Kastner again negotiated with Eichmann. After the war, Kastner testifies on behalf of a Nazi general, a guy who had blood on his hands, but helped Kastner get the Jews out of Hungary. And look at the people that Kastner put on the train. People from his town, relatives, friends, some rabbis and wealthy people. The irony here is some of these rabbis who were on the train, that went on what is called the Kastner train, some of these were the same rabbis that had told their people in Hungary, you stay here, we'll get through this. Don't go to America. It's a treifa Medina. It's a bad land. It'll work out. They left. They could have told their people to leave, but they didn't leave. They didn't do that. So there's a trial that's held in Jerusalem before the Jerusalem Supreme Court. Kastner this is the most controversial trial in the history of the state of Israel. Kastner is placed on trial. He's declared a collaborator by the Jerusalem Supreme Court. He's arrested, put in prison. He appeals. He appeals to the full Israeli Supreme Court. In between the two trials, a group of young Israelis line up outside of Kastner's apartment, and when he steps out, they pump him full with machine gun bullets. They kill him. Posthumously, the trial goes to the full Israeli Supreme Court, which acquits him. He was an egomaniac, the court said. He thought personally that he could save the Jews. But he wasn't a collaborator. He tried to save the Jews. And whatever anyone says about Kastner, he saved over 1,600 Jews. He's one of the few people of whom it can be said, along with Oskar Schindler, that saved Jews. Was it a form of collaboration? Should he have tried Gewalt? The answer is I don't think it was collaboration. And I don't think you can hold him guilty for not screaming from the rooftops about what was happening to Hungarian Jews. After all, there were thousands upon thousands of Polish Jews who had fled to Hungary. They were talking to people all the time about what was happening in Poland. Hungarian Jews, like many French Jews, believed that their country would not betray them. French Jews thought, this is a democratic country. Yes, there's been some anti-Semitism, but surely they will not betray us to the Germans and kill us, and we will be killed. Hungarian Jews who are Hungarian patriots, they thought Hungary, whatever it may be, labor battalions, anti-Semitic legislation, it made no difference. Hungary will not betray us. But in the end, the Hungarian government betrayed Hungarian Jews and the French government betrayed French Jews. So, in mirror image, probably 25 at the most percent of Hungarian Jews will survive the war. 75%, probably more, were murdered. In France, remember, 25% are murdered, 75% are going to be saved. Two different countries, two different outcomes. Personality is important. Petain and Horthy will collaborate. And in both countries, forgive me for repeating myself, both deportations and murders could not have taken place without the collaboration of civil servants, the army, and the police. So, my friends, we have dealt with France and we have dealt with Hungary. If we had more time, I would talk to you about Romania. I talked to you about Belgium. I talked about the Netherlands. I talked to you about Italy. I will answer any questions that you have. Next week, we get into how the rest of the world responded, how the Catholic Pope responded, how FDR responded, and perhaps if we have time, how did the British respond as well? The Holocaust is murky, it is sordid, it is filled with villains, it's filled with people who saw and did nothing, but it's also filled, as I tried to tell you in this lecture, it's filled with heroes and heroines. Remember, in Poland, it's Irina Sendler, and there are Jewish women in the resistance. In France, it's Archbishop Salège. It's countless numbers of French men, women, and children who sheltered Jews, warned Jews, and saved Jews. Archbishop Salège, and of course, in Hungary. There were Hungarian priests. There were a number of Hungarians that did shelter Jews. Nowhere near the number that should have been, but they were there and they should be mentioned. Wallenberg, outside of Hungary, but coming into Hungary, Wallenberg, Prelaska, Angela Rata, Karl Lutz. The Nazis had no moral bottom. The Nazis were willing to do everything they could. There's an asymmetry in the Holocaust. That is, for the Nazis, the murder of Jews took precedence over almost everything. On the other side, there were very few people that were prepared to show the strength, the resilience, the tenacity in order to save Jews that was commensurate with the Nazi tenacity in murdering Jews. That's a fundamental asymmetry of the Holocaust. It's only when there were men and women that would show the same strength and tenacity and perseverance and courage in saving the Jews that commensurate with what the Nazis were doing to murder the Jews, that large numbers of Jews could be saved. And that, my friends, is what you saw to a limited extent in France and Hungary. All right, Jeffrey, let her rip.
Oh, Professor Berk. Okay, this is we got a lot to cover and already lots of questions coming in. So we will thank you as always for taking us through a very, very difficult period in time. story. I've got before we get going on all of these, you say many times personality is important in history. I wonder if you could talk just for a minute about not just personality, but timing. We're talking so much about Hungary and 1944. It was in the scheme of things, the grand scheme of things, it was very close to the end of the war. And if they had just, so many what ifs, if Horthy had just kind of stayed with the Axis powers as an ally for Hitler, might it have been that that a larger percentage, a significantly larger percentage of Jews would have survived the war?
Had Horthy ordered the French police not to participate in the roundups,
The Hungarian police.
Hungarian army, that would have been something. But remember, we don't invade Hitler's Fortress Europe. We don't invade France until June 6th of 44. Operation Margareta took place on March 19th of 44. So it's clear that the Germans are on the defensive. Everybody knows the Allies are going to invade in France. They don't know when, they don't know where, but it's coming. You're right. I tried to say personality is important. Had there been another man, Horthy fired Calais. Calais refused, from 42 to 44, Calais refused to deport the Hungarian Jews. Suppose he had been there as prime minister. You don't know what would have happened. Would the Germans have killed him? Would the Arrow Cross have assassinated him? We don't know. But again, the anti-Semitism in Hungary, the presence of the Arrow Cross, and the willingness of the Hungarian police and the army, that turns the tide.
All right, let's start getting to these questions. Along the topic we're on right now, Mark Ehrlich writes in, what happened to Pétain and to Horthy after the war? Were they tried for collaboration?
Pétain and Laval were tried for collaboration. Pétain was sentenced to death, but he was 89 years old at the time. And because he was a great war hero, he was commuted to life imprisonment. His prime minister, Pierre Laval, was convicted of treason, arrested, and executed. Horthy will survive the war. When the war is over, some Arrow Cross people will be placed on trial and they will be executed.
Okay, we've got several people asking for recommendations. You mentioned several books along the way, several people asking for recommendations on what to read. Of course, if people want, we do have for our Eastern European travelers, we have a recommended book and media list that I'm happy to send out to
Let
them.
me just say, and maybe you can post it some way, the best one-volume account that will cover everything that I talked about. I'd like to think that I amplified and put things in there that are not found in the books, but the best one-volume account is by Saul Friedlander. It's the second volume of a two-volume account of the Holocaust. It's the second volume that you want, called The Years of Extermination. The Years of Extermination by Saul Friedlander. The best book on Hungary is by a man by the name of Bram, a Hungarian Jew, B-R-A-H-A-M. I'm not sure if the title is The Politics of Genocide, but you look up Randolph Bram. I think Randolph is his first name. That's the book that you want to read. It's dated a little bit. There's more information, but that's what you want to read. Then for France, there's a book by Maris, a book by Paxton, P-A-X-T-O-N, Maris, M-A-R-R-A-S. There are a number of good works on France. So those are the four books that I would recommend here. I would start with Friedlander's book because it's a long book, big book. He writes very, very well, and he covers all of the countries that experienced the Holocaust.
Thank you. Okay. And always we have people writing in with recommendations. Ellen Stern recommends a series called A French Village.
That's what I said.
Yeah.
That's what I said.
Okay. So
that is a magnificent series, A French Village.
Yeah.
With a strong Holocaust component.
All right. Bruce Lerner, a couple things. Number one, says, my grandfather fought for Franz Joseph during World War I. Several of my father's first cousins were killed at Kamenets-Podolsky, and another cousin And this is actually from Deborah Lerner. And another cousin made and distributed Schutzpasses for Karl Lutz, which you were speaking about earlier.
Right.
It really is incredible some of the connections we get from people watching.
Right. Now, the first part said what about not Kamenetz Podolsk, but the first part of what he said writes in.
Deborah Lerner wrote, my grandfather fought for Franz Joseph.
All right. Let me deal with that.
Yeah.
We used to do a trip in November, the East European trip that we now do once a year. We used to do actually 3 times a year, in March, the summer, and in November. In November, it's cold. In order to save fuel, we wouldn't go to the main synagogue, the Dohani synagogue. We would go to a synagogue that's attached to it and is run by the Dohani synagogue. The synagogue is called the Synagogue of Heroes and Martyrs. It's a synagogue. You walk into the synagogue and you see 2 dates, 1914 to 1918. This synagogue was dedicated to the soldiers of the Habsburg armies, Jewish soldiers that fought for Franz Joseph and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I think the figure is about 15,000, maybe even more, Jews died fighting for the Habsburg Empire. That's called the Heroes and Martyrs Synagogue.
One more personal connection from a participant here. Jay Lipschultz writes in, are you aware of Major Plage, who helped save his workers, including my grandfather, at HKP work camp outside of Vilnius? So
all right, that's Lithuania.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
there were people that did this. There were decent people who, at the risk of their lives, I mean, if you sheltered Jews, you were dead, and your family was dead. I think I've said this to you before. Forgive me, but it's an important point. If I said this, I can't speak for anybody else. I speak only for myself. If we were anywhere in German-occupied Europe, and I was not a Jew, and a Jewish family came to me and said, "Would you shelter me?" I'm not sure I would. I'm not sure, given the risks and given the penalties, the hostages to fortune that I would be leaving. I know what I would not do. I would not betray a Jew. I would not kill a Jew. I would not rape or sexually exploit a Jewish woman or girl. That I know I would not do. But to risk my family's life as well as my own, I'm not sure.
Okay, lots still to cover here. One question, let's go to this one. It's a little bit of a logistics question from John Winninger, and it wouldn't be a session without a question from John. The Wehrmacht was desperate for trains to send supplies and reinforcements to the USSR. How much did transport of Jews interfere with the German war effort?
I used to think that it did interfere greatly with the German war effort. But recent scholarship has shown it wasn't a question of trains. John is right. They're struck for manpower. The trains are running. It didn't take away from the German war effort. And let me introduce another theme since we're on this. The war against the Jews by the Nazis was done on the cheap. There weren't that many Germans involved in the murder of Jews. For example, if you take the total number in the German-occupied areas of the Soviet Union, there were no more than 3,500 men in the Einsatzgruppen. Now, they were helped by, again, the police battalions, SS police battalion, and they were helped on occasion by soldiers in the Wehrmacht. But it doesn't seem to deter from the German war effort. In Auschwitz, where 1,100,000 people were killed, 1,100,000. Of the 1,100,000 people who were killed in Auschwitz, 900,000, at least 900,000 were Jews. The total number of Germans that served at Auschwitz during the war, never at the same time, but the total number was 7,000. So 7,000 Germans are responsible for the death of 1,100,000 Jews. So it's the Holocaust on the cheap. It's also the most efficient aspect of the Nazi war effort. The war against the Jews is very, very successful, very efficiently conducted. And keep in mind, the Germans are able to do this with small numbers of people because they have large-scale collaboration from the indigenous populations. The war against the Jews was a pan-European phenomenon.
Let's talk about Hungary for a second and what happened after the war. We've got a question. Did many surviving Hungarian Jews return to their homes in Hungary? And did they face the anti-Semitism that returning Polish Jews found, which we spoke about with the Kielce pogrom last week?
I don't know the figures, but my intuition, and from what I know, most Hungarian Jews who survived, most of them, went back to Budapest. Now, I'm going to say something that will sound flippant. It's not meant to be flippant. I won't mention her name, but we have one of the best guides in Europe in Budapest. She is superb, absolutely superb. And I've asked her. Her husband has experienced anti-Semitism. And I asked her, why don't you leave? She had spent time in Israel. She has relatives in the United States, has come to the United States. Why don't you leave? You know what she says to me? I should leave this goulash. I should leave this Hungarian humor that only Hungarians can understand. I leave this Hungarian music. Can I leave Budapest? I cannot do it. So Hungarian Jews, most of them, I believe, will go back to Budapest. Not all of them. We've had in Schenectady some Hungarian Jewish survivors, and in Albany, and we bring them sometime to lecture to our classes. So many Hungarian Jews did flee, but many also fled in '56 during the Hungarian Revolt. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarians left. They didn't want to live under communism anymore, and thousands of Jews left also at the same time.
All right, nice comment from Dan Bender, who shares the name of the psychologist that you had mentioned. The 90-year-old psychologist was Daniel Kahneman.
That is correct.
Author of Thinking Fast and Slow. So we've got that name.
Right. Thank you for putting that in.
Yeah.
He died very, very recently. And I must tell you, again, just to make the point even further, when we go on our East European trip, we go to Theresienstadt, or Terezin in Czech. There's a museum of the artwork and the painted work and the musical scores that were composed by the inmates, the Jewish inmates at Theresienstadt. This gives you an idea of the talent that was lost. And the Czech Jewish community was a small Jewish community. This is only a slice of European Jewry. So again, never forget the quantitative thing. I'm repeating myself, but it's important. 6 million dead Jews, 1 million of them, 500,000 were children. But again, never forget the qualitative aspect. How many brilliant minds were cut off just because of the Holocaust?
All right. By the way, Dan Bender had a nice suggestion. Maybe we'll do it in the future. Said, fabulously informative. Maybe you could teach a course on righteous Gentiles. So maybe we'll think about that for a future virtual.
That's a good idea, Dan. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah. All right. Going over to a question from Ken Auerbach. Ken would like to know, what factors explain the differing governmental responses to the issue of saving Jews? Denmark and Bulgaria versus Hungary and France.
All right. First of all, a shout out to Ken. Good to hear from you, Ken. Denmark was a democratic country. Also, the Danes were treated with kid gloves. In German eyes, the Danes were Aryans. And the Danes collaborated. The Danes provided Germany with fish, with cheese, all sorts of things. The Danes didn't make trouble for the Germans. But the Danish government was a democratic government. There weren't that many Jews in Denmark, less than 8,000 Jews in all of Denmark, highly assimilated. And again, the French King Christian was a decent man. He made it clear to his people that the anti-Semitic policies employed by the Germans were really contrary to the best Danish values and traditions. Now, there's a theory about Denmark that goes back to the 19th century. Denmark lost a war with Prussia in 1864. Germany wanted some Danish provinces, Schleswig and Holstein. The Danes lost it. When a country loses a war, it is faced with the tough questions. Why did we lose? What do we do now that we've lost? Should we fight again? But it's impossible. We cannot defeat Germany. A number of Danish academicians and Lutheran ministers said, no, our contribution to European society and civilization is not that we're going to make the best cheese in Europe or sell the best fish in Europe. No, we are going to be the best Christian humanitarians in Europe. And that is what plays out here now. This is Christian humanism in its best sense. It also provides us with a dilemma. When I talk to people, why Germany? Why was Germany the home, provided the impetus for the Holocaust? There are a number of reasons for this. I went over this in the first lecture. One of the facts this was Germany was a Lutheran country. Luther was a German. Luther was an anti-Semite. So we say there's a contribution in Germany of German Lutheranism. But in Denmark, nearly all of the Danish Christians, 99% of the country is Lutheran. 91% of the Lutheran clergy were involved in the underground in one way or another, sheltering Jews. So what's the variable here? The variable is not Lutheranism. It's what the political scientists call political culture. Denmark is a different country. It's a tolerant country. It's a democratic country with no long-standing traditions of anti-Semitism. Hungary had a lot of anti-Semitism, and Hungary was not a democratic country. It really wasn't. Had a history of anti-Semitic legislation. France, again, this goes back to an old theory about French history. There are two Frances, historians used to say. The France of the Revolution and the France of the counter-revolution. There were many French people, religious Catholics, people in the army, wealthy French people who linked the Jews with communism. All of that plays out. And of course, the personality, Marshal Pétain. You know what the slogan of France was? It came out of the revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? When Pétain comes to power, it's family, work, and country. That's the slogan of Vichy France. That's what you get played out in France.
Well, the different priorities. Okay, a couple more. We'll start to wrap up here. Ronald Weiss would like to know, how did Klaus Barbie escape after the war, and how was he captured, and did the Americans protect him?
Another good question. Many Germans escaped. They took off their uniforms. Even the people on the death marches would speak about taking off their SS uniforms, changing into civilian clothes, and then just running away. Hard to find them. Very hard to find. We didn't have records of everybody who's in the SS. We'll find many of them. That's one issue. The other issue is, remember, everything must be seen in its time and place. And that is, right after the war, the Cold War begins. And American intelligence agencies like the CIA are desperately looking for people who know about Russia, know about the Soviet Union. So lo and behold, who did they find? Germans who had fought in Operation Barbarossa. People with blood on their hands. But this is the Cold War. We don't give a damn about these people that have committed war crimes. The classic example is Wernher von Braun. We don't get to the moon without Wernher von Braun, the great missile creator. This is the man that created the V-2. And the V-2s were built under his command in factories, underground factories, in which they used slave labor, including large numbers of Jews. We don't care. He's going to get us to the moon before the Russians get us to the moon. So he's the best example of that. As far as Klaus Barbie is concerned, Barbie evades, and he may have been protected. This I'm not sure, so I don't want to say. He may have been protected by the United States for some time, but eventually we get him.
Okay.
And he turns over to the French, and he's sentenced to life in prison, and he dies in prison, I believe.
Okay. All right, one more. We'll wrap up here from Bruce Kriegel, who writes
Bruce,
in.
a former
Bruce.
student.
Yeah. So Bruce would like to know,
Bruce
can you comment on the Emergency Rescue Committee and Varian Fries participating in saving the Jews of Marseille? Was the ERC successful in saving other Jews?
Yes. And again, I'm moving so fast and trying to cram in so much information. You'll all have to forgive me for not mentioning Varian Fry. Bruce is absolutely right. The emergency committee was very successful in bringing over people like Marc Chagall and others, some very famous, very prominent Jews who had fled to France, and some French Jews. They are able to get out by virtue of Varian Fry. There are a whole group of people here. Some of I've met, Sugahara, the Japanese envoy in Kovno, who saved Jews. Governor Mendes, a Spanish diplomat, who saved Jews. There are people who save Jews. There are. You have to mention them. You can say, you grit your teeth and say there weren't enough of them, which is true, but you have to remember that they were there.
And that's a pretty good spot for us to close out this week. Professor Berk, as always, thank you. We've got one more Tuesday in April, one more session. As you mentioned, next week we'll be looking at kind of the wider world, FDR, the Catholic Church, all of this in relation to the Holocaust. So we will see everybody next week, same time, same place, same link. Until then, I wish you all a good week, good health, and shalom.
And thank you all very much for tuning in. I appreciate your questions. A good teacher should learn from his students as well as to teach them. And I'm grateful to all of you. We're done with a matzah. Shalom uvracha. The good times are coming. Take care, everybody. See you next week.